Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are. You're all heartily welcome to this panel where we will discuss the steps which have been taken by the Working Group on Bribery in the last years to enhance the effectiveness of the fight against foreign bribery in the world. Now, we usually do this through our rigorous monitoring procedures. But in addition to that, in 2018, the group made the decision that we will try to upgrade or update the 2009 recommendation for further fighting the foreign bribery offense in the world. So through a series of substantial discussions, not only within the working group, but also with our external stakeholders, we have managed to go to a text which was finally adopted in November 2021. So this is a brand new text, and despite the fact that not all members of the group and not all of us who were participating in its development are 100% satisfied with it, because things could always be better. We have to say that all directions which we faced until now were quite positive, and it looks that we have done a good job. And the way we did it, we simply said that since 2009, when the old recommendation has been adopted, some new features have emerged on our area of work, plus the existing ones needed to be updated. If I translate this into more bit technical language, that means that we have dealt with some new topics in this new recommendation, and that we went deeper in the rest of the topics. So what were the new topics? What are the new topics? The first one, of course, and this is a really crucial step forward for all of us, we have entered the area of demand side of foreign bribery cases. As you know, the OECD Anti-Bribery Convention is only incriminating the supply side, giving of bribes. So this time we entered the other side too, simply following the research which we did some years ago, and which has shown to us that in foreign bribery cases, only 20% of the bribe takers are being brought to justice in comparison to 100% of those giving the bribes. So only in one fifth of cases, both sides, the bribe giver and the bribe taker, are being sanctioned. Of course, we couldn't do that in the form of introducing a new incrimination, because that would be clearly going much further than the convention allows us. But we did some other things. We introduce some specific actions for countries to address the solicitation, acceptance of bribes, and better support companies facing bribe solicitation risks. Then the next part, which is also new, is our sanctions and confiscations, in the way that we addressed mitigating factors in sanctioning, which until now were not developed to the extent which would satisfy all of us enough. Another brand new topic are non-prior resolutions, which is a general term which we introduced following, let's say, the feature which has different names in different legal systems: plea bargaining, DPAs, NPAs, and so on. So we call them non-prior resolutions, simply because of the fact that those mechanisms were used in nearly 80% of cases that have been reported since the convention entered into force. We did not make those resolutions mandatory for countries, because we clearly heard from some countries they will not support it if this will be a mandatory feature. But if countries decide to go this way, then they will have to follow the standards which have been introduced. Quite new are also some provisions in the area of international cooperation, just simply to ensure more effective frameworks for mutual legal assistance and so on. We also developed quite an extensive part on protection of reporting persons. In 2018, the working group conducted a what we call a horizontal survey of how our countries are dealing with the protection of working persons, and we found out that not all of the countries have satisfactory legal framework in place, and even more that, of course, in practical terms, even if there is a satisfactory framework in place, in practical terms, this protection is not being offered to the reporting persons. And, you know, for all the years, everybody, not only the Working from Bribery, but also other international organizations were telling countries, well, you have to protect whistleblowers, but nobody told them how exactly should they doing this. Meanwhile, we got the European Union directive, which is of course limited to the protection of EU funds. So we went broader, and we really hope that this global text now will help our countries to protect the whistleblowers more effectively. Next new topic: incentives for compliance. Now we listened to our companies, to our business sector, saying that it does make sense that they spend a lot of resources in developing effective compliance systems, and they only get benefits from them if something goes wrong. So this time we offered, or we are, let's say, advising countries to offer some benefits also in other areas, not only in the existing criminal proceedings. Last but not least, data protection became extremely important in the last years. So important that we realized in some cases that it has basically effectively slowed down the enforcement of the Anti-Bribery Convention. So what we want to achieve is that our basic work, international cooperation, the effectiveness of internal controls, ethics and compliance, and due diligence processes are not impeded by data protection rules and privacy rights. So those are the new topics. If you will take your good read of the rest of the recommendation, you will see where we have enhanced the existing topics, but this gives a lot of reasons for our discussion today. And we really have selected, let's say, an impressive list of speakers. Today will be with me Mr. David Four, who is the acting principal assistant chief of FCP unit of the US Department of Justice. Ms. Susan Hawley, who is the executive director of Spotlight on Corruption from the UK. Ms. Olga Pontes from Brazil. She's a senior business leader, professor, and advisory board member. And Mr. R. Peter Singh, who is the global markets and India leader from Forensic and Integrative Services of Ernst & Young. We have foreseen that this, let's say, session will last 1 hour and a half. So 1 hour and 10 minutes, we'll have discussions, I will not say among ourselves, let's say between the panelists, myself. We will try to be as interesting as possible, as informative as possible. And at the end, we'll have 20 minutes for Q&A. During our discussion, you can enter your questions into the Q&A chat box. So, and I will take a look at them, and at the end of the session, I will ask those countries to our panelists. If you will have identified the panelists to whom you would like to ask the question, just put it into the question too, so I will know whom to ask. If not, you can ask a general question, and I will try to identify let's say, the panelists who will be most qualified to answer to your question. So this is basically the plan for today. I'm sure, I will not say that we will all learn something new today, but at least we will see what is in there in the new recommendation, which will start to be, let's say, monitored already very soon. You know, it was, as I said, it was adopted at the end of November. And of course, the normal question now was when the Working Group on Bribery will start monitoring countries against the benchmarks, against the standards of that recommendation. We decided for a gradual approach. So we will start slowly with countries where there have not been an on-site visit yet. And they will have to reply, let's say, to some new standards which do not require too much of time for their implementation. This graduality will take some time, so we count that when the 5th evaluation round of the WGB will start, currently this is foreseen for 2026, then the recommendation will be, let's say, assessed according to all its standards and to all the countries. So this is not just a text which will remain on the paper. Those are the standards which will be alive and will be strictly monitored by the Working Group on Bribery. And we also hope that also other countries will join in implementing those standards. So before going into the, let's say, really substantial discussions, I would share, specific discussion on specific topics of the recommendation. I would just like to throw out a general question to all of our panelists and welcome you all here. Is there anything you would like to say in general terms before diving into specifics? So since we will spend so much time later on, I cannot give you more than 2 minutes for each of your responses. So I will call you as I see you on the screen, and Olga, you're the first one on my screen. So first question, well, the same question goes to all of you, but you're the first one to answer it.
Hello, everyone. I would like, first of all, to thank you, the OECD team, to invite me here today and say that it's a pleasure to be with so brilliant panelists and welcome the audience that is together with us. Dragon, I have no doubt that the 2021 recommendation on anti-bribery comes to strengthen enforcement for foreign bribery, comes also to encourage countries and the private sector to fight together against corruption, because together we can do even more. The updated and extended also recommendations show evolution from where we were in 2009. We need to recognize that even though we had progress, the bar is higher and we still have a long road ahead. With union, resilience, and hard work, all challenged to implement recommendation will be overcome by countries. And soon we'll have another update version to reflect the challenge for a new future society configuration and continue to promote a fair world for better lives.
Well, thank you, Olga. That was really a good start, it was really a good one. Sue, you're the next one on my screen.
Hi, thank you so much for inviting me here. I started working on corruption in 2000, so just after the OECD Convention on bribery was born, and it has genuinely transformed the space of corruption globally. And I think the way the working group has set up its monitoring of the convention and its recommendations has been crucial to that, and it really is. It is the gold standard, actually, of monitoring report on these international anti-corruption instruments, and we always love reading the reports and the amazing experts that the working group has. And I think the UK Bribery Act, which is now seen as a very significant global piece of anti-corruption legislation, would not have come into being without the OECD working group on bribery. So we are really delighted that there is a new recommendation that's been updated to give the OECD the tools to carry on its monitoring and to grow, to recognize that bribery isn't a static thing, and that it does change, and the way people go about bribing and how we need to tackle it changes. So we really welcome the recommendation, and we look forward very much to the new set of reports and some really proactive engagement with countries where they don't meet the standards. Thank you.
Thank you. So since you're representing civil society, which is usually never satisfied with whatever the public side do, I know that you have some criticism ready for us too, and we are willing to listen. We will really try to do better in the years to come. David, your next one. What do you see? What are the general effects of, let's say, the recommendation? What's your general impression of it?
Yeah, thank you, Drago. Very much looking forward to this discussion, and it's great to have such a diverse selection of panelists in terms of their viewpoints and experiences. So I have to give my usual disclaimer that obviously the opinions are my own and not those of the Department of Justice. But with that, look, Drago, I think you gave a very good overview. To me, from a prosecutor's perspective, and of course I recognize I come from that perspective, in particular from a U.S. prosecutor's perspective. my view is that this is, we're very much supportive of these recommendations, and they were very, promising, I think, by emphasizing, what others have said, which is to, strengthen the focus on effective enforcement. And I think we'll talk more today about, two areas. One is obviously, and to us, I think that has been kind of a practice that we've had for a while, is the really big focus on international cooperation, and including how coordination in multi-jurisdictional cases, which many of these are, works. The other one is the issue, Drago, that you flagged on non-trial resolutions, and I think that's also, of course, in many ways, sort of the experience we've had in the United States, both with respect to corporations and individuals, but I think, at least from our perspective, I think that allows, I think, for a more effective regime in fighting bribery, and so I think that'll perhaps open up certain possibilities in the future. And I think, look, the other areas are frankly equally important. Incentivizing private sector compliance, improving. Recommending that countries sort of enhance requirements on accounting and internal controls, because as we all know, bribery usually happens when there are poor controls. And so I think this is a terrific document, and look forward to speaking more about some of these areas today.
David, yeah, what we try to achieve with this recommendation is basically to give some additional tools to the prosecutors, because the core job of the WGB is to ensure the effective enforcement of the convention. And if you say that you're satisfied with it, this is a big acknowledgement for us, because we also try to do is also try to offer some incentives for the companies, because we came to the conclusion, this is basically a very natural one, that this is the public side, the investigators, the prosecutors, and judicial, we cannot fight this fight alone. So that's why we also put some emphasis on the position of the companies. And if we manage to achieve, let's say, sort of a balance, then I'm happy, and I'm sure the rest of the group will also be very happy. Arpinder, what's your view in general terms of the recommendation?
Thank you so much, Drago, and thank you everybody at OECD for inviting me. I think I've been dealing with bribery and corruption issues as an investigator for many, many years. But one thing I must compliment everybody on this group and the OECD is the fact that I think there's been such a shift in the way companies in the emerging market are dealing with bribery and corruption issues. Historically, it was always reactive. I used to only do investigations when the DOJ or SEC or anyone is running an investigation. But the fact is, in the last 3-4 years, there's so many companies in the emerging market, not just in India, but in countries around India where I have jurisdiction. And they're all spending a lot of money, effort, time in building controls. So I think as a compliment to all of you that there's such a change that majority of my work today is proactive, where we are building frameworks, policies, and that just shows a change in mindset, right? Because people are not waiting for the incident to happen. People are, working on their frameworks. Also, there's a lot of governance through whistleblowing. And some of the things, Drago, your note mentioned around protecting the whistleblower, I think is very critical, especially in the emerging markets, which are a little bit more contentious than the developed countries. It's a little bit dangerous sometimes. So I think protecting the whistleblower is extremely critical. I like that. And also GDPR, the data protection, sharing information across borders, especially on investigations. I think with GDPR, it became a little complicated for some of us working on investigation, how to share information with the regulator. I'm sure David would talk about it. What information can we share as per the local laws, countries. So a lot of good information. So I actually enjoyed reading the recommendation. And I think it'll be very good guidance for countries in the emerging markets, because we do rely on these guidelines when we create frameworks and policies. And a lot of us as practitioners also rely on it as we create frameworks. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Arpinder. So, listening to four of you, I would take this as a recognition of good work of not only the Secretariat of the working group, but also, let's say, for all our countries, because we ran through a series of discussions, what topics should be included. And we also did this with our external stakeholders. And then when we entered substantial discussions, how particular standards should look like, that required extensive engagement of countries and our other stakeholders. So I really hope we got a good result, and I really hope this will be helpful in the future too. So those were the general words. So now it's about time to dive into specifics. And the first one is the detection. We all know that we cannot investigate if we don't detect. And in 2017, at the OECD, we took a look at the role of different actors in detecting corruption through another horizontal study, where we have tried to identify what are, let's say, the most effective or sources of information which can help us to detect foreign bribery offenses, which are a bit less effective sources. And I am very happy to say that the discussion on this one was basically among the easiest ones when we got to the decision, should we include that or not? The first part of it, of course, it has been mentioned several times already today, is the whistleblower protection. And I have to say this topic was rated as the highest priority by the WGB countries at the start of the interview, or the start of the review, which means that countries really thought that we have to develop some standards in that area. When we were doing it, we had extensive and exhaustive discussions about how to frame the standards. And I have to say that we all learned a lot because countries were really engaging hard. We got, of course, the first information from Chapter 2 in the detection study from 2018. We spoke about whistleblower protection in 2016 anti-bribery ministerial at the OECD. But throughout our discussions in the working group, when we are developing the written text, then we really learned a lot. And hopefully we managed to respond to those, let's say, comments and challenges. So you, as a representative of civil sectors, civil society, you know especially well how important the whistleblower protection is. So the recommendation introduces an elaborate framework. What is your assessment? Did we go far enough, or there's something more we could do when drafting it?
I mean, I think the fact that it's in there is really, really important. Absolutely, whistleblowers are key. And I think it's a counterweight to the trend to, you know, the only source of information is to get companies to self-report. You know, that's not true. Whistleblowers are a really, really key source of information. I think, you know, I mean, I think it'll all be about the implementation and looking at the reviews and seeing what best practice emerges and whether we can use this to drive up standards. The key areas, I think, from a civil society point of view are really, is there enough clarity about compensation? I mean, I think the US does have really good practice in this area around providing proper financial incentives to whistleblowers. We would love to see some best practice emerging on that, because in the UK, we find it very, very uphill struggle to get people to accept that whistleblowers should be compensated when they lose all of their career and, you know, to expose wrongdoing. So we think that's really important. And yeah, I understand that maybe the working group couldn't go further than it has, because it has to bring on so many, you know, people when it's doing this, but that's an area in the monitoring we'd like to see really looked at, and, you know, what the lack of compensation actually means in terms of, you know, the amount of whistleblower statistics actually resulting in action. I think that's another area around transparency about how whistleblowers are treated, how many sources of whistleblower complaints actually do result in enforcement action. I think it's another really good metric we'd love to see the OECD monitoring. I think there are two or three other areas. The other is about international cooperation. I mean, we have seen, because bribery is global and companies that pay bribes might be global, you know, we've seen this with a recent whistleblower that, you know, his information resulted in you know, very significant penalties being imposed on a company, but he was being pursued by the company in another jurisdiction. And I think we'd love to see the working group act together more closely when there are cases like that, to really support the whistleblowers who have helped them bring cases. And I think we also need to make sure there really are strong penalties when people actually disclose the identity of whistleblowers. And we'd like to see the Working Group on Bribery really monitor how that is, whether that's happening in countries or what's happening when cases happen where someone breaches that disclosure or confidentiality. And it shouldn't just be the private sector. We need that protection from the public sector as well. The public sector, people in the public sector should not be immune from facing sanctions if they breach confidentiality. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, you're right. You see, I see this area as the one where the working group can, well, of course, in close cooperation with countries and through monitoring of countries, can really achieve a lot, because not so many countries have really effective whistleblower protection systems in place. So with let's say rigorous monitoring in this area, let's say the WGB will really be in position to achieve huge changes in the world of whistleblowing. Olga, turning to you, the framework has a corollary for companies in the GPG, which is aimed at the private sector too. What changes do you foresee in practice for companies in this area?
Aisu has just mentioned there is no question about the importance of the whistleblowers, and also how important is the role of the private sector in implementing whistleblower management system. Whistleblowers are a valuable source of information and evidence, not only for successful prosecution, but more mainly to help stop wrongdoing early, before unethical behavior cause even more hurt and damage to society. Search around the world, as we know, shows that the private sector is increasingly investing in whistleblower management system, even if you know that not all investments are by heart or by conviction about what is right thing to be done. They are still very important to protect whistleblower. Nowadays, I can see a big movement of companies. I can see companies paying attention to disclose a formal commitment to do not tolerate any form of retaliation. But commitment is one of the steps of first conscience and accountability. Companies are also investing in availability, accessibility of reporting channels, and in the possibility to receive anonymous reports, confidentiality and the independence of the receiving, handling, and investing process, and the independence also of the staff involved in this process are the second foundation of a trustworthy whistleblower management system. I say second, Dragon, because for me, the first foundation is a real culture of integrity. I know that codes of conduct, we know that codes of conduct and commitment and beautiful compliance program promising integrity in its process is an important way, but it's not enough. We still need, and we still think that it's necessary to go ahead, go beyond the best practice and the legal requirements. What really ends with the culture of fear and the culture of silence and feed a culture of integrity, free of all forms of retaliation, is the strong presence and consistently ethical and moral virtuous leader, especially at the top of the hierarchy of the company. That is my thoughts.
Well, thank you. Well, you're right. You see, this will be important topics for both sectors. And if let's say activities in one sector will not be followed by activities in the other one, then I'm afraid we will not be using the whole potential of this recommendation. Still staying in the area of detection, we will turn out to accounting and auditing, because let's say the gatekeepers, auditors, accountants really have an important role in detecting and reporting. And Arpinder, we usually see a limited engagement from the accounting and auditing profession on the foreign bribery-related issues, although I have to note that the International Federation of Accountants has been active and they provide valuable input in the context of the review process. In the past, the working group has often recommended that countries raise awareness of the profession to better identify foreign bribery red flags. There seems to be a reluctance of the profession to recognize its role in uncovering bribery, even though they are a valuable detection source. Do you see this disconnect too? And what do you think? Has this changed in recent years as foreign bribery has gotten increasing attention from law enforcement?
I do see a significant change in the way accountants are viewing bribery and corruption. I can give, the example from some of the emerging markets like India, where, there was no definition of fraud, for instance, just to go into a little detail. And then fraud was defined under our Companies Act. It was a very broad definition for the first time in so many years, 100 years, you're kind of defining fraud. And then, because earlier it was only cheating and theft, as you know, as a lawyers. I'm not the lawyer, there are a lot of lawyers on the panel. But the fact is that with the definition of fraud, the Institute of Chartered Accountants of India, for instance, have defined it to include some irregular payments or potential payments to government officials in a way which is not correct or illegal. So there is a acceptance, at least, that does fraud include bribery and corruption or not. I know it's a very basic thing, sounds very simple, but trust me, in different countries, there is some debate about that. When you suddenly include fraud, bribery and corruption in the definition of fraud, that means auditors end up having to report on that, because most countries have some reporting requirements around fraud. As a result, suddenly you have to start reporting on bribery and corruption. There's a new concept with most accounting associations across the emerging markets, at least that I see, which have started calling it non-compliance with law and regulation, which is popularly known as no-CLAR. So no-CLAR is becoming a bigger deal than it used to be. So, coupled with reporting fraud, as well as reporting on non-compliance laws and regulation, which is different than reporting on fraud. Now you have auditors in a position where they have to cover these requirements. And most countries have removed the materiality definition as it relates to bribery and corruption, because whether you pay a 10,000 rupee bribe or whether you pay a 1 million rupee bribe, earlier you kind of put a few things under the carpet under the concept of materiality, as a lot of you would know. But the question is, you can't put a non-compliance of law and regulation on the carpet as it relates to materiality. So there are a few technical things, but the fact that this is being debated extensively across countries, and institutes of chartered accountants in different countries are dealing with this particular issue, I think is a great sign. So that means suddenly bribery and corruption comes on the table for accountants. Earlier it may not have been on the table in a number of countries. So I think, Drago, the good news is that accountants are debating this topic, trust me, extensively. I'm on calls late at night with a lot of my colleagues across the world debating, is this a bribe? Do we have conclusive information? We need someone like David, Sue, and Olga to tell us, is it really a bribe? We're accountants, we know the facts, we see the transaction, I've seen the voucher, it's a little circumstantial. So how do we support that? We are not the police. We don't have access to a lot of data across countries. It's a little tough. To be fair to accountants, you have the voucher, but that only tells you half the story. The other half of the story is not in the voucher. We don't know who this third party is in Africa. We don't know who this third party is in Eastern Europe, or we don't know, what is the substance of the transaction. So I think there's a lot more of a journey to cover, but I think we have started that journey, Drago. We are there. There's a lot of, thankfully to the US, there's a lot of reporting in the 10Qs and, a lot of statements around fraud, bribery and corruption, which also forces some of us in the emerging markets to comply with that, because there are a lot of companies in the emerging markets who are listed in the US, which have to comply, or they're doing significant business outside the emerging markets, which have to comply. So I think, trust me, the journey started. I can go into a lot more detail, but I don't want to take more time.
Well, thank you. And I have to tell you, I know exactly what you're talking about, because for the last 12 years, I'm doing exactly the same thing. Doing the forensic auditing, you always have to try to think what is behind the transaction you see. And I really, as you said, I really see movements in this area too. So it has started, and let us hope that it will all soon bring the fruits too. Moving to another source of detection, the foreign bribery, which is the voluntary disclosure. The foreign bribery report from 2014 found out that in 1/3 of concluded cases of foreign bribery offenses, the source of detection was voluntary disclosure. The study from 2017 found out that voluntary disclosure was a critical source of detection already in 3/4 of detected foreign bribery cases, and that some countries incentivize it through leniency policies, for instance, by lowering the charge or the sanction or making it a condition to enter a non-trial solution rather than going to trial. We took this into account when drafting the recommendation, which as a result calls for countries to encourage voluntary disclosure. And there's nobody more qualified than a representative of the US to tell us, is this a really important source of detection? David.
Well, thank you for the vote of confidence, Drago. Look, of course, look, it is an important source of detection. There's no question. It's certainly not the only source for us of detection. We have, as you know, a variety of ways in which we obtain information about what may be a bribery scheme. But focusing on voluntary disclosures, yes, I think it is relevant. It is one of the, we say one of the tools in our toolkit in terms of how do we learn about a potential bribery case. Again, I mean, obviously we have some experience with that in the United States, and we have in some ways sought to formalize the process for what happens to a company that voluntarily discloses and then cooperates and remediates fully. And I say that for the following reason. I think I understand that in other legal traditions the notion, the idea that someone would voluntarily walk into the police or to a prosecutor's office and say, hey, listen, we have a problem, you might want to look into that, is completely foreign, and I think historically, even looking at Europe a few years ago, and I think there are still many people in this field who have a very different mindset and have, traditionally, sort of from a defense lawyer perspective, the notion that a defense lawyer would say, hey, my client may have committed a crime and I want to report this to you, is something that historically just didn't exist. And I think there has been a change both in the US but also in Europe and elsewhere about the benefits of that. And that the reason I sort of describe the framework here a little bit is because I think, my personal view is, if you want to incentivize voluntary disclosures, there have to be some carrots, as we say, for companies to do that. Because otherwise, if you just say, please come and voluntarily disclose so that we can investigate, where is the incentive for a company or a lawyer for a company to come in? And I think it works, absolutely, but I think you have to have a balance of what we call carrots and sticks. And I think that is why it's important, I think, to spell out what are the criteria, how do we measure what a voluntary disclosure is, so that everybody is essentially playing from the same sheet of music. And so I think that's where, frankly, I think Drago will talk about that later, is where non-trial resolution mechanisms come in. But I also think it's because it benefits obviously the company to a certain extent. Otherwise, the company wouldn't do it. But I think it, obviously, as you pointed out, it is a source of detection for prosecutors, and it is, again, by no means should it ever be the only source, because if that was the case, then what we do is basically entirely dependent on companies coming in, which certainly can never be the case. And that's why, as I said at the outset, it is one of various ways, at least in the US, how we identify bribery. But I think for this to work globally, especially in jurisdictions and in countries that don't have this sort of tradition of cooperating with prosecutors and of bringing cases to the attention of authorities, I think for that to work, you're going to have to create structures that make it very clear and spell out how what the rules of the road are. What do you say a voluntary disclosure is, and what happens next. Without you can't prescribe certainly what an outcome in every case will be, but you have to lay out a path so that companies feel incentivized to do that.
Yeah, thank you. Olga, from your experience, To what extent do incentives make a difference in a company's decision to self-report its misconduct?
As my colleague, I have no doubt that the make total difference in the private sector. Leaders normally make decision every day, balancing always the risk with economic and reputational consequence for not only itself, but mainly for the business. Take the wrong decision can result in a lot of losing for business and for the one who takes the wrong decision. And maybe, as we can see also, to the ones that accept supporting the wrong decision also, no? And in this way, I can say that before any decision of self-reporting, companies will consider assessment of risk of business disruption, potential prohibition of doing business with the public sector, potential reputational damage, cost of investigation also is another key point, potential management change, potential civil litigation also, and many other risks that we could mention here. Understandably, I used to say companies will want to know what is expected and what is likely to achieve before taking any decision. In this way, Dragon, I would say that correct and more compelling incentives, guarantees, and for sure, a legal and clear and safe framework make all difference in companies' decision and should encourage further self-reporting. In Brazil, we'll have the CGU following the OECD principles, and we have a long-term plan for it.
Well, thank you. But still, introducing too many incentives can pose a risk for justice not being made. So, in your view, did we insert or introduce sufficient safeguards that this would not happen? What should countries be wary of?
I think this is one the working group on bribery is going to have to watch pretty closely, actually, because we have to remember at the end of the day, countries want their companies to come out best. And there is a real risk that leniency could lead to a race to the bottom. And also actually exacerbate forum shopping between jurisdictions. And so I think it's going to have to be watched really closely. I mean, from a civil society perspective, I think there's no doubt there are real reputational risks here as well. You know, there is a sense that people are getting away with it. You know, they're just not being punished properly. You know, and where there's been real harm from corruption, that, you know, causes a lot of anger. And I think you have to look at the kind of corollary of it, which is, I mean, we've seen this in the grand corruption kleptocracy space, where, you know, governments have entered into settlements with people who were seen to be very egregious corrupt actors. And there's a real sense that they were impunity, basically, and that these people got away with it. So if you get that with corrupt actors, you're going to get the same with companies, really. So I think it has to be watched really carefully. I think David's point's really important here, which is actually the definition of fulsome, timely and voluntary disclosure is absolutely key, because what we've seen in the UK is that definition has been stretched to its absolute limit. And you have companies that sat on their hands, you know, until halfway through an investigation by our authorities, and then suddenly thought, oh yeah, no, we're going to cooperate, and got the credit for voluntary disclosure. For us, that is a nonsense, and you actually undermine all the incentives to actually self-report if you don't have some very tight criteria, and if you don't have the stick, which is to bring back to David's point. So I think the area that we think the recommendation is a bit weak on, we would have liked to have seen more on, is actually, you know, what needs to happen where a company doesn't self-report or voluntarily disclose, you know. And what we see in the UK is that the courts are not playing their role sufficiently strongly enough as the stick. And we would have liked to see more emphasis on, you know, whether courts are properly resourced and properly independent enough to play that role. And I mean, I think the key example for me is, you know, when the French introduced their version of a negotiated procedure, you know, it was actually a tax case, but when the company said, we don't want to make this settlement, and the authorities were like, see you in court, and the court went, we're going to charge you double. Here's your fine. It's really, really heavy. And that's what you have to make it work, which is the courts playing their role with the stick.
Well, I can only say that I feel sorry that you were not there when we were discussing this topic in the group. But I'm sure that, let's say, the group will put a lot of emphasis on this issue because it's really important. You know, we cannot water down the positive flavor of the recommendation by, let's say, giving too many leeways of companies, and especially with standards which don't have the defined content yet. So this is a really important task for the future work of the group. Arpinder, voluntary disclosure implies that internal controls and compliance programs are in place to allow for internal detection. The revised good practice guidance introduces the use of internal control systems to identify foreign bribery. So where do we stand on that front today? Is greater attention being paid to risk management, notably through internal controls, or we just hope so?
So Drago, I'll break my perception to two parts. I would say companies which, as I said, have private equity investment from connected with Europe, US, or have some joint ventures or business outside the emerging markets. I think those companies spend a lot of time on internal controls because I see the benefit, as David said, on the carrot and stick approach. I think most of us know the sentencing guidelines. We've gone through it in detail. We understand the point system. We also understand that you have to have tight control. So I think those companies in spirit, I'm saying, not just in form, spend a lot of time and effort on controls. Training, trust me, I mean, I can tell you in India, I've got a team of 40 people which just do bribery and corruption training. It was never the case. We used to have ad hoc one person 3-4 years back who used to do training as a side subject. So I think in substance, there are a whole set of companies which do business internationally, which are actually in spirit doing the right things, where they're having trainings, documentation, monitoring, third-party risk management, all of the stuff which you're prescribing, they're running it quite well and in spirit, which is a good change. I mean, I remember 10 years back, a client approached me and said, hey, can you just download it on Google? Just give me some FCPA, UK Bribery Act scope. And I was like, really? You just want a checklist there so that when someone comes to audit you, you have something and you're complying with some shareholder agreement. So I think that's changed in the last 3-4 years, as I said, which is a good part. But I think the problem is, if you have a company which has a problem in a local country, like India or any other country in Asia, or I don't know how much benefit they get in the local country as it relates to controls and process. So when you have an actual investigation, for instance, in India under the Prevention of Corruption Act 1988, which is our local statute around bribery and corruption, I think when you go to court, they care about the financial transaction. They care about the bribe. I've never seen a court judgment which talks about training, controls, benefit, the carrot and stick approach. So I think there is some way to go where there's a balancing of the laws, so that the action meted out in US or Europe is the same as meted out in the local country based on the local law. So I think there is some effort, Drago, if that can be done, there will, I think, be a lot more acceptance and adoption of controls and framework, which are extremely critical to identify these issues in time, to stop these issues from happening, actually protecting the company. So I think that's my viewpoint on at least what's happening on the ground.
Thank you very much. Well, we mentioned already that one of the new topics are the non-prior solutions. In this section, which is dealing with, it is composed of two parts. The first one, encouraging countries to introduce NTRs. The second one, providing standards to ensure transparency and accountability of the NTR systems. So, David, what are your views on our decision to encourage countries to adopt the non-trial solution systems?
Yeah, look, it's a little bit similar, frankly, to what we just talked about, which, again, I'm speaking, of course, from my own perspective. In the United States, I think non-trial resolutions are, frankly, both with companies, but also with individuals, not only in the context of FCPA enforcement, but more criminal law and corporate criminal law in the U.S. generally. A tool that prosecutors have used with quite good effect, I think, over many years. If you think about the idea of individual defendants, pleading to a crime before it goes to trial, or of course companies, entering in a resolution short of trial, whether it's a guilty plea in the U.S. or a deferred prosecution agreement or a non-prosecution agreement. So I think it's, as I said, I think at the outset, it is, to me, from my vantage point, it allows us more more options. And why is that important? I think part of that is it allows us to distinguish. If you're talking now, in the foreign bribery context, in the corporate context, I think it allows us to distinguish between different actors. Because bribery has so many dimensions, and you could have sort of the best of greatest hits of bribery cases with incredibly pervasive schemes that went on for a long time in multiple countries, going all the way up to the top, with really, really horrible corporate culture, total lack of compliance. And then you could have, on the other extreme, sort of a company that has tried to do the right thing, but people, because companies act through its people, or through their people, and someone might have paid a bribe, and so at least in the U.S. you have liability. And so I think part of the non-trial resolution idea here that I think the OECD is recommending to other countries is allow sort of a greater set of options in terms of how do you address what may be criminal conduct. And I think, look, to me, that is not to say letting companies off the hook or letting individuals off the hook. And I know that sometimes I think people criticize it. They say someone you need companies should always it has to be a guilty plea or has to do a trial. Look, I think just like in the context of an individual, that sometimes may be correct, and sometimes I think part of our experience with this is that these other non-trial resolution mechanisms that exist can be effective. It can hold companies accountable. We have, there's, at least in the United States, whatever the resolution is, there's always a statement of facts when the DOJ has a resolution, and they are public, and they're quite detailed, and we list what the crimes were and the misconduct was that the company engaged in. And so I think in terms of transparency, and this is one of the, perhaps what Sue was referring to earlier, I think in this area also applies. There has to be transparency, there have to be clear standards, and the idea cannot be, and this is the other side of the coin, it cannot be that we are going to water down enforcement. It should frankly be the opposite. And I think the one concern that perhaps exists is, depending on how you implement it, just like with voluntary disclosures, there have to be very, very clear standards. And I think one way, at least in the US, in which we try to address it is laying out, what happened, here's the evidence, here's what the company did. And then, in the US, the company, when it enters into a DPA, for example, there are obligations associated with what the company has to do during the period of the DPA in terms of cooperation, in terms of reporting, and whatnot. So I think it can be used ideally, and I hope that will be the case, that it is something that enhances the fight against bribery. It is something that lays out clearly what the expectations are and what the requirements are on the company, so that it achieves the opposite of what I think some people are concerned about in terms of, is this something that we're going, companies are getting away with something. And I think that, to me, that I don't want that to happen ever. And I think part of it is that the challenge is going to be in other countries, again, that don't have this tradition, perhaps, is how do you create a model that allows prosecutors to do their work, that holds company and corporate actors accountable for their wrongdoing, while also giving them a path, to sort of, moving on and correcting their course of action and becoming a better company. Because ultimately, look, all of I think we all are trying to get to a place where, companies do better and where companies engage in less bribery. And I think part of this is, again, sort of what I was talking about earlier, carrots and sticks applies here as well, that you have to allow companies a path forward so that they can, meet their obligations and then hopefully become a better company. So that's sort of my 2 cents on this issue.
Thank you. Well, Sue, I know you can be painfully frank and straightforward, and may I ask you to be like that because we are running behind the schedule a bit. So, of course, this applies for everybody else too. So the question is, what is your assessment of the NTR standard? Sufficient to ensure transparency and accountability or not?
So I think it's really good that there are standards for the reason David said. I mean, I think there are issues, certainly in the UK, these settlements have been referred to as get out of jail free cards for companies. But as people have, said quite legitimately, it's better that that's happening than companies are getting nothing happening at all, just because prosecutions are too hard. So it is some form of accountability and some kind of recognition of, the being fined and recognition of wrongdoing. I mean, I think the key things for us are that this mustn't be the only tool. That these bodies mustn't lose the ability to prosecute. That's our big fear. And we've seen a little bit of evidence of that in the UK, that people have become so obsessed on settlements that they lose the ability to bring the case in the court. And that's a very real risk, I think, if the world only starts doing settlements. We would have liked to see much better language about victim compensation. This is real, and the harm of corruption being reflected better. And that's not just about settlements, that's in court hearings as well. Clearly, I think the real benefit of them is that they do allow for these cross-border settlements. So you can get, proactive enforcers like Brazil, do get a significant cut for their work. We'd like to see more work with local enforcement authorities to bring people to account, and more settlements that help raise standards globally. The other area I think we would have liked strong language on is really about proper admission of guilt, which I know is tricky because one of the benefits that companies feel is that this is not an admission of guilt. And I want to just say something about the transparency issue, transparency and oversight, which is key always for civil society. I mean, it is true that there are really good statement of facts, and they're poured over by us all. But the real difference between a statement of facts in a DPA and in court is that in court you get the names and you have the details of the demand side of who was bribed. And actually, I think the problem with DPAs is they've kind of played a suppressing role in the naming of names when it comes to the demand side, because these people aren't actually, their names aren't put into, the statement of facts. And I think that's something we have to have a kind of discussion about. And the other thing is really about, the evidence emerging from DPAs is we don't know that the companies have actually changed, because there's never any publication of the monitoring reports. Whose word are we taking for it that they have actually changed? Is it just the company and the prosecutor? And I think that is a public confidence thing, and we would like to see much more publication of the monitoring reports.
Well, you took it literally, painfully. David, a small follow-up. US authorities, you'll be known as being extremely internationally active. So what's your assessment? Will the new standards on NTRs increase international cooperation and facilitate multi-jurisdictional resolutions too?
I hope so, and I think so. And I think, again, as you know, we have over the last several years had significant number of cases where we didn't only have cooperation with other countries, but where we had a sort of multi-jurisdictional coordinated resolution. And I think, look, I'm not the world's greatest expert on this, but I think to the extent that there are mechanisms that allow companies to, obviously, to resolve a case short of trial, the easier it becomes to, from our perspective, to coordinate a resolution with that company and a foreign country. And so we have, as everyone knows, we have had, a fair number of these cases. And I think to the extent, because if you look at it from the converse, if the company had to be tried in every single instance, it would be very difficult to have a coordinated resolution. So I think depending on how this recommendation is implemented by countries, I think it will facilitate these, multi-jurisdictional resolutions, which again, I think they're good. I think they're helpful. I think they also sort of validate the efforts of foreign countries in fighting bribery. We are fortunate in the US, we've had sort of a longer history of that, but I think the more, and this is my personal, sort of conviction on this, the more countries participate in these matters, including in resolving corporate cases, I think the more it strengthens those local authorities, because it signals to a company that there are more than 2 or 3 or 4 enforcers around the world, that there are credible enforcement threats in their own countries, which frankly, I think that to me is the fundamental idea in the fight against bribery. It has to involve authorities all over the world, and so I think to the extent we can facilitate multi-jurisdictional coordination in this and sort of recognize the efforts of those other countries in holding people and companies accountable, I think the better it is. So I think, look, we'll have to see how it all gets implemented, but I think the idea of non-trial resolutions in other countries, I think will hopefully make it easier for us and for those countries to coordinate a resolution.
Thank you. Olga, 2 questions for you, and I really thank you for short answers. So the first one, you think that, let's say, since now we are encouraging countries to adopt the NTR system, this is sending positive signal to the private sector? And second one, on international cooperation, companies were always complaining that there is a lack of cooperation among different jurisdictions, and this had a chilling effect on voluntary disclosure and cooperation. Do you think what we are introducing now will, in trying to enhance international cooperation, will be, let's say, seen as a positive step by the private sector too?
Yes, Dragon. As you can see, in the last decade, we saw an increase in the use of international cooperation in multi-jurisdictional. As David had mentioned, if you have more countries definitively willing to cooperate in the fight against corruption, probably we can hope that this trend continues to increase and embrace more countries, because non-trial resolution for sure are extremely important for companies. Although we face a critical challenge for it, that is the adoption of clear and transparency framework, as very well described in the OECD 2021 recommendation. A lot was done, really a lot. But in Brazil, especially, we still do not have the best scenarios for a non-trial resolution. We have a large room for improvement, and the big room of improvement is represent increase of risk for companies.
Well, thank you. That's really good to know. We spoke about the incentives already, so I don't think we need a long introduction here. Let's go straight to the questions. David, in the US, the private sector has been, let's say, required extensively to cooperate with the DOJ, since this is the heart of the FCPA enforcement policy. Can you ever consider a possibility having an effective enforcement possible without enlisting the aid of the companies?
Well, yes. So let me answer both of those sort of points. I think the first point, cooperation by companies, yes, I think that is obviously something that as a policy matter we have encouraged. But again, I think part of it is, and this is critical for other countries to do as well, I think, you have to be transparent. You have to spell out, and we've tried to do that in the US with, what is called a corporate enforcement policy, which is a publicly available document that really spells out what our expectations are for a company that chooses to cooperate with a government investigation. It makes sense, I think, in the US context. But I'd also want to say it's a one-way street. It is cooperation by the company with us. We're not cooperating vice versa with the company. So we are obviously prosecutors. We do our own work, and if a company chooses that it is in its interest to cooperate with the government, that is the company's choice to make, and that is obviously something we encourage. But we have to, and I think this is critical, you have to spell out what that means. What are our expectations of cooperation? So that the company is frankly on notice, that it's fair to the company, but it's also, fair to us in the sense of here are clearly our expectations. And that may be, I'm going back to what I said earlier, that tradition of, I spoke about disclosure earlier, about sort of cooperation is, I think, also something that in many parts of the world is not something that, if you ask a defense lawyer, and I get that, why would I want to cooperate? If you want to incentivize cooperation, again, I keep repeating myself, but it has to be laid out clearly what that means, what the expectations are from the authorities. And it also has to be, there has to be something about, well, what, from the defense perspective, what do I get out of this? Because I'm not going to cooperate if there's no benefit. I mean, that is obviously a very logical consideration. And so I think for this to work, you have to have a pretty clear sort of set of rules about what you really mean by cooperation. It obviously is different in each situation, but I think the framework has to be there. Your second question, Drago, is enforcement possible in this space without the cooperation of companies? The answer absolutely has to be yes. If the answer is no, we would be doing something very wrong. And I think, in many of our cases, this is why, again, I consider cooperation as one, is something that is relevant. If a company wants to bring to our attention certain facts about what happened, that is great. But it is one area of us getting information. We are not relying on companies to just do the work for us. I mean, if that, I think that is something else. I think the extent to which cooperation would replace the work of prosecutors, that cannot happen. And frankly, I think the one concern is, I know this from sort of prior years and elsewhere, prosecutors sometimes look at companies that want to cooperate with some suspicion, because what you don't want to do is have a company's cooperation sort of interfere with a prosecutor's work. And so I think that is all the more reason why, A, we have to make sure, that we can do our cases even if a company does not cooperate, and because we're not relying on that, and I think it can never be the case that that sort of cooperation becomes something that replaces some of the work that we do, and I think that is critical in sort of how you want to implement and how you want to structure and incentivize cooperation. I think is going to be very important for countries to consider, because it has to be, again, it has to be clear what cooperation means and what the requirements are on companies.
Thank you. Olga, from the perspective of the private sector, I guess this is a welcome effort for countries to reach out to companies. And in your views, are the incentives adequate and sufficient?
And Dragon, they are by now, but I believe that we have a space for more. To promote OECD principles in Brazilian government, we have a focal point dedicated for this, and we have also monitor. Brazil has also excellent initiatives to incentivize adoption of compliance system. In the public sector, for example, we have from CGU, Selo Empresa Proética, we have from the Agriculture Minister, Selo Mais Integridade, from Infrastructure Minister, we have Selo Infra Plus Integrity, and many others. In the other sectors, for example, that include the private one, we continue to work together to promote good practice. And we have several task forces organized by CNI, that is the National Confederation of Industry, The Global Compact also do a fantastic work to do this. That is, I had the pleasure to coordinate the GT anti-corruption for the Brazilian network. We have Instituto Etos also promoting best practice. The EBDE, that is the Instituto Brasileiro de Direito e Ética Empresarial, that I'm current coordinating the Compliance Commission. We have several action. I could spend, sorry if I do not mention the several ones that we have, but the important to highlight it is all these actions are supported nowadays by fantastic professionals and compliance professionals who with courage and have to have courage and resilience and experience also make a difference to face, have challenge and vulnerability and back forwards progress.
Thank you. Well, so we already discussed the safeguards which would prevent too much of a leniency towards the private sector in the previous chapters. Would like to add something here, now listening to other colleagues?
I think only to say that I think some of this is also maybe about attitude and actually the kind of coming to the negotiation with companies, feeling like prosecutors have an upper hand. So when I listen to David, I think, oh, he sounds like, he would walk away from, if the company was trying to extract things that weren't in the interest of justice. And I think that's the trouble with these, behind the scenes things. We have to have kind of faith that there are these negotiations that go on between prosecutors and the companies, and that prosecutors are going to represent the public interest and actually walk away when the company just wants to extract too many compromises. So I think then just separately, I want to say the other area, it's great. We really support the idea that, you should look at whether companies have compliance procedures in place before they're public contracting or get export credits. That's really important. But we would also like to have seen a bit more. We'd love to see in the follow-ups that the working group on bribery looks a little bit about how debarment is used to incentivize good corporate governance, and whether countries are using them effectively, and having proper central registries that can be shared between jurisdictions. So that's a kind of countermeasure to the too much leniency, is to make sure that where companies really haven't cleaned up their act and aren't doing the right thing, they can be properly penalized.
Thank you. Well, I have to say the working group is aware of that, and I'm sure that in, let's say, the monitoring to come, a lot of emphasis will be put on that. Now, concluding this discussion, let's change over to also on our key non-member countries, which means those are the leading exporters in the world which are not members of the working group yet. Some of them do criminalize foreign bribery, but since they're not our members, of course, we don't have a mandate to examine their legislations and how they are enforced. So Arpinder, from your perspective as a practitioner in a non-member country, in the key non-member country, do you anticipate that the new recommendation will have any influence in a country like India?
I think it does, Drago. There is a lot of focus on bribery and corruption and reducing it in the country. If you just take financial transactions, countries in the emerging markets are known for cash transactions, right? That's how bribery starts, right? You have a lot of cash transaction aggregated at factory sites, etc. And I think there's so much. I think COVID may have helped, but with technology and the fact that everybody is now using, electronic transactions, and even in the tier 2, tier 3 cities in remote parts of emerging markets, you don't have cash transactions happening. Those excuses are going away. So countries are working very hard to make everything electronic when it comes to banking transactions. And I think that's a big start. Today in India, for instance, I don't even carry my wallet anywhere because everything is done on the cell phone. You just want to make a transaction, you can transfer money from here and there. Even a small roadside vendor is selling vegetables. He has a small card with a scan number, and you take your phone and you can scan it. So pretty much in all corners of India, for instance, which is a fairly large country, which used to earlier not be connected on banking as much, you can actually make transactions all over India just with a cell phone. So, and everyone seems to have a smartphone, whether you're rich, poor. It's becoming a lesser of a divide to own a phone because the cost of phones have also gone down. So I think countries are working hard in reducing it. And I find this was a big step. There was also obviously a very public thing in India around demonetization, which I'm sure all of you have heard of, which was around taking currency out there. And, it was again meant to reduce the bribery and corruption risks. There's so much enforcement. I mean, every day, every week in the newspaper, you hear of some very influential person being arrested for bribery and corruption. So there's so much action at the corporate level. There are independent directors and boards who are petrified of any compliance risks because they're afraid of their reputation, they're afraid of going to jail. As I said, there's a lot of enforcement. So combined with technology adoption by the government at the country level, combined with policies in serious enforcement, I think there's such a fear to pay a bribe. I mean, in India, we used to joke about the fact that, you pass a red light and you just pay someone 100 rupees and you don't need to take a ticket. Even that's been stopped. It's all electronic now. You get a ticket in your house. So it's even paying income taxes has become contactless. So the whole concept of bribery where you don't meet a person and that reduces the risk of bribery is so much. So I think other countries I know outside India are also moving towards technology. But I can tell you definitely that the huge amount of bribery and corruption risk, which was at the junior level, large volume of transactions, small transactions, seems to have reduced significantly. I mean, obviously, you cannot say it's been removed, but definitely reduced significantly. So I think the trajectory I see, at least as a practitioner, is pretty good. Two more things I'd like to just add is the fact that there has been a change in the law also, which I think has made a lot more focus on not just the bribe receiver, but also the bribe giver. It was always an issue in India that the supply side was a little uncovered from a legal perspective. And I think that's been changed. There's very serious penalties around paying bribes. There is also a timeline by which you have to, you're talking about non-trial resolution. That's interesting for me because there's a timeline now to finish your investigation, which was never there earlier. Other investigations could take a significant amount of time. Now you have special courts looking at bribery and corruption cases only. So I think with the whole effort around the judiciary, around the law change, around electronic transactions, technology, enforcement, I can tell you right now, I meet so many corporate senior people. There's a huge fear in doing the wrong thing. So I can tell you that whole emphasis, I think with help from organizations like yourself, Drago, has really helped. And I think there's been a sea change. Obviously, it's not perfect. There's still a lot of work which is required to be done, but I can tell you it's significantly better today than it was a few years back.
Well, thank you. Well, having in mind everything what you've said, I have to say that we would, but not only that, India is one of the key non-member countries, so we really hope that, let's say, if nothing else, the fact that this year they're chairing the G20 group will help them to, let's say, to show some interest in joining the WGB, because that would enable us both, India to enhance its standards and us, let's say, to level the playing field a bit more, what we do. So this is what we plan for our panel today. Of course, they will still have some answers to respond to. And opening the floor now, I give first the floor to Mr. Nicola Loco, who is the representative of the business at the OECD. Nicola.
Many thanks for giving me the floor, Drago. My name is Nicola Loco, and I am the chair of BIAC Anti-Corruption Committee. We as a BIAC are the institutional stakeholders for business at OECD, and we have actively contributed to the review of the recommendation from the very start, feeding in the perspective of private sector. In this regard, we very much appreciate the additional reference now included in the recommendation, such as the focus to the demand side, the explicit applicability to SOEs, helping level the playing field, the reference to the potential of technology, and the reference to the incentives for companies to invest in their compliance program, which we have long been calling for. In our view, the 2021 recommendation can and should be considered a milestone for fighting corruption. And I would like just to focus on two very important points in this regard. The first is the more holistic approach the recommendation promotes, and the second is the multi-stakeholder approach. In fact, the recommendation enjoys the support of the business, the civil society, academia, who have been consulted in a very inclusive and transparent review process. In other words, the 2021 recommendation is not only a document for governments agreed by governments, but through the feedback and the knowledge of different actors, it establishes a basis for collaboration and dialogue, which is critical if we want to eliminate corruption. If we want zero corruption, we must work together. So my question to the panel would be, how can we as business support OECD with the implementation and awareness raising of this instrument, of the recommendation? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, would anybody like to answer the question? That the question was how to support the OECD, and let's say, just to shorten the time, Nicola, you see, we are really counting on the private sector that you will not only wait for the let's say, guidelines or incentives from our governments. There's many things the private sector can do by itself. The companies can already start implementing what the countries will have to suggest to them. And this will be really a good, let's say, addition to the text of the recommendation. From time to time, we can hear some rumors, let's say, that the recommendation is a bit too friendly to the companies. So it's up to you to prove the otherwise. Meaning that if now the private sector will really embark on implementing everything what the recommendation is providing for, then this will be a simple proof that it is not, now it's not anymore about private sector being the bad guy trying to misuse the weaknesses of the public sector, but really private sector acting as a partner to the prosecutors, investigators, and of course also judiciary. And if you do that, you will make everybody happy. So we have 4 questions in the Q&A, which gives us 2 minutes for each of them. The first one is the question, does the panel have any thoughts on how to protect enabled whistleblowers in SMEs? Because normally they will unlikely have access to useful internal mechanisms. So any question here, Olga, maybe may I ask you to try to respond to this one? So how can SMEs protect whistleblowers?
As I have mentioned, I believe in my first answer, a culture of integrity can protect whistleblowers, a good corporate governance, the board of directors, well educated with principle and moral very strong, CEOs educated as well. For me, is the biggest point for protection of whistleblower. And if you have that, if you have a culture of integrity with the high-level management of the private sector, willing to do what is right by heart, not by pen, understand? We will have, for sure, effective controls in place, policy and procedures, commitments, good channels with independence, compliance team, investigation team, independent, and you have all the process that a good framework recommends. But for sure, for me, the topic is good corporate governance with integrity leaders doing what is right by heart, not by pen.
Thank you. David, the next question is for you. And this, although it's quite complicated, I will still ask you to reply in 2 minutes. So how does the new Biden anti-corruption strategy pillars 1, 2, and 3 impact or reframe the pursuit of potential bribery cases when it comes to carrots and sticks?
All right. So look, I would say this: the Biden, the White House's anti-corruption national security strategy, which I think was, published late last year in December. I think it's a document that basically, I think, recognizes the incredibly corrosive effects of corruption worldwide. And so it's obviously much broader than what I was talking about. We in the DOJ, in the FCPA unit, are one part of addressing corruption. But obviously, as everyone on the panel knows, corruption is much broader than enforcement and just enforcement by one agency. We're of course important, but there's many dimensions to addressing corruption in other countries that are beyond law enforcement. But I think to the question about how it sort of reinforces carrots and sticks, look, I think the pillars on that are increasing sort of attention to the issue, increasing funding, holding people accountable, I think is sort of consistent with what I said. I mean, I think that strategy is broader than what we do, but is consistent with what we do in the sense that we are trying, recognizing this is a serious problem and then identifying and holding people accountable. And I think that is obviously sort of the sticks part of it. And I think the carrots we've talked enough about and is in the strategy as well about cooperating with foreign authorities, coordinating actions and so forth. So I think, look, to us more generally, that document I think is very relevant, as much for the message it sends as some of the content, because I think the message is this cannot be an issue that is ignored, and it is a real issue, not just in countries where the corruption happens, but also for the United States and its effects here. And so I think it's sort of gratifying to me to see a real high-level commitment and recognition of the problem and an intention to do something about it government-wide. So that's what I would say about that.
Thank you. Arpinder, what would you say if somebody would ask you what is the best way to motivate and promote whistleblowing?
I think, as I said, being in an emerging market where things can get a bit dangerous, I think protection is the most important thing. Physical security, protecting the identity of the whistleblower is extremely critical. Allowing anonymous whistleblowers, I think that's a debatable point in some of the countries where, some laws say that you have to actually put down your name. So I think allowing people to remain anonymous, giving them confidence that their identity will remain, protected. Make sure the whistleblowing process is such that the goal is not to find the whistleblower, but actually investigate the issue raised by the whistleblower. That's extremely critical. It sounds very basic, but trust me, as a practitioner, that happens many times. I go to companies and they say, can we find out this fellow who's making our life miserable? But that's not the goal, right? Goal is to find out if the issue is correct or not. And I think that's extremely critical. Second is, I think, protecting the whistleblower so that the person's career does not get impacted post the investigation, because the senior leadership also at some point in time debates the issue. So I think that's also very critical. Remunerating the whistleblower is a debated point, especially in India, because obviously a lot of US lawyers have done a great job of educating all of us about the Dodd-Frank Act. And I think the largest number of whistleblowers in the US must be from China, or, and that may not be always for the right reasons. So I think that's a debated point. How to properly structure the monetization is still open. I mean, there's a 50-50 parameter, but I say security number one, anonymity number one, protecting their career, making sure that they continue with life in a good way is extremely critical.
Thank you. Well, remuneration is in the heart of the next question, because let's say one of the participants says that only a few countries in Europe have set a system of remuneration for whistleblowers. And does it mean that money isn't an effective motivational measure anymore? So, the last one for you.
No, I don't think that's. I don't think it's because money isn't a motivational measure. I think in the UK we have this debate all the time, and there's a kind of sense it's a bit un-British to do something for money. But the point is, people's lives are destroyed by whistleblowing, and they find it hard to get jobs. And they face all sorts of hurdles. So I think we absolutely have to look at it properly. I don't know what the reasons in other EU countries are. I know France at one stage was looking at compensation, and there is something around language, whether financial compensation is an easier kind of language to win over people in the UK than incentivization. But ultimately also, I think incentivization comes from seeing what you blew the whistle about turning into action. And I think that's where robust enforcement results come in, that, the more, probably the reason the US does get a lot of whistleblowers is because people see that they get results. So I think, that you have to also take that into account.
Well, thank you very much. You see, this is exactly the answer which I expected. So that was it. That was our panel. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Sue. Thank you, David. Thank you, Arpinder. You were a great panel. We all learned a lot today. Hopefully, our participants too. And usually I'm quite happy when a panel comes to an end. Today, I feel sorry because I feel we could continue discussions for hours and hours about the let's say the new recommendation, what would be the most important task for the group in the future. I think we all know we have to ensure that the recommendation will not only remain on the paper, we have to enforce it, we have to implement it. This should be the task of all of us. So, my dear panelists, thank you all once again, and thank you all participants. And I wish you that you would enjoy the next panels too. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Drago.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.